In the last hour, Starbucks role models the 2 essential steps for crisis management. Starbucks to close 8,000 U.S. stores for racial sensitivity training. Racial tolerance. Starbucks to shut 8,000 stores for an afternoon in the last 4 hours. What getting woke will cost Starbucks in the last 6 hours. Starbucks to shut 8,000 stores on May 29th for racial bias training. Bay Area expert weighs in on Starbucks bias training in the last 8 hours. Starbucks to temporarily shut 8,000 plus cafes for bias training. Starbucks to close 8,000 stores for racial tolerance training. Earlier today, Starbucks to close all U.S. stores for racial bias training. Starbucks to provide racial tolerance training to U.S. staff. Starbucks to close thousands of stores for racial bias education. Starbucks to close U.S. stores for afternoon of racial bias education. Confrontation at SoCal Starbucks over bathroom caught on tape. Starbucks to shut U.S. stores for racial bias education. Starbucks board member, "We've got to make this right." 60. Black-owned alternatives to Starbucks. Yesterday, Starbucks will close 8,000 U.S. stores on May 29th for racial bias training. The Starbucks 911 call got 2 black men arrested. Starbucks to implement unconscious bias training. Starbucks training shutdown could cost it just $16.7 million. Starbucks to close all 8,000 stores for racial bias training on May 29. Starbucks anti-racism coffee break sets example analysis. Starbucks confronts racial bias issue. Starbucks to briefly shut 8,000 cafes for racial bias training. Starbucks to close U.S. stores for racial bias training with Philadelphia arrests. Starbucks again becomes focus of cultural debate. Starbucks closing all company-owned stores for anti-bias training. Starbucks to shut U.S. stores for racial bias training. Starbucks to close 8,000 stores for anti-racism training. Starbucks to close 8,000 stores for half-day for bias training. Staff at 8,000 Starbucks stores to get racial bias training. Starbucks is boldly addressing its racial bias problem. Starbucks to close 8,000 U.S. cafes for racial bias training. Starbucks to shut 8,000 U.S. outlets for bias training after protests. What Starbucks said the last time it closed its stores for an afternoon. Starbucks to shut cafes for race training. Starbucks to shut stores nationwide for racial bias training after arrests. Starbucks to close 8,000 U.S. stores for racial tolerance training. Starbucks to temporarily shut 8,000 plus cafes for bias training. Starbucks to close stores May 29th for bias training. Starbucks is shutting 8,000 U.S. stores on May 29th to conduct bias training. Why your local Starbucks may close on May 29. Starbucks to close 8,000 U.S. stores for racial bias training. Starbucks to close U.S. stores for racial bias education. Starbucks to close for a day to conduct bias training. Starbucks to close stores for an afternoon for bias training. Starbucks to close its more than 8,000 U.S. stores for racial bias training. Starbucks closing all stores May 29th for racial bias training. Starbucks will close its U.S. stores May 29th to conduct racial bias education. Starbucks to close more than 8,000 stores for bias training. Starbucks closing stores May 29th to conduct racial bias training. Starbucks to close 8,000 U.S. stores for racial bias training. Starbucks will close 8,000 U.S. stores for racial bias training. Racist. Starbucks to close all locations on May 29. Starbucks wants its new cold foam to be the next pumpkin spice latte. Starbucks will close 8,000 U.S. stores May 29th for racial bias training. Starbucks to close stores afternoon of May 29th for racial bias training. Starbucks to close all U.S. stores on the 29th of May for racial bias education. 8,000 Starbucks stores to halt operations for racial bias training. Starbucks will close all U.S. stores on May 29th for racial bias education. Starbucks closing stores for racial bias training. Starbucks to close over 8K stores for racial bias training. Starbucks attempts at selling culture comes back to haunt them. Starbucks CEO meets with 2 black men arrested at Philadelphia store. Starbucks needs to work harder to condemn racism, say brand experts. Starbucks announced as newest signing at Leeds Retail Park. Starbucks CEO meets with black men arrested at Philly store. Starbucks to train workers on unconscious bias. CEO says Starbucks faces brand crisis after arrest of 2 black men. Starbucks CEO meets with 2 black men arrested at Philadelphia store. Whites only? Man claims LA. Starbucks denied him bathroom use.